Imagine a US president secretly funds a foreign dictator, authorizes warrantless detentions overseas, or orders a covert drone strike. Inside the United States, these actions would clearly violate domestic law, but abroad, such actions are not even unusual. Is that hypocrisy, or is it simply the way international politics works? That tension lies at the core of what realists call the dual moral standard. The dual moral standard is the claim that domestic and international arenas operate under different ethical rules. Domestically, we expect the rule of law, rights, and democratic accountability. But internationally, no world government exists to enforce those values. For realists, that lack of a higher power, what we call anarchy, changes the moral equation. As Hans Morgenthau put it, the political leader's responsibility is not to universal ethics, but to the national interest, even if that means using deception, coercion, or violence. In his Politics Among Nations, published in 1948, Morgenthau asserts that universal moral principles cannot be applied to the actions of states in their abstract, universal formation, but they must be filtered through concrete circumstances of time and place. As a result, he famously warns that, while the principle of fiat justia pereat mundus, let justice be done though the world may perish, may guide individual action, the state has no right to let its moral disapprobation of the infringement of liberty get in the way of successful political action, itself inspired by the moral principle of national survival. For realists, this isn't cynicism, it's prudence. In a self-help world, states must prioritize security. Universalist morality becomes a luxury they cannot always afford. Hence, Washington's Cold War alliances with authoritarian regimes in Latin America or the Middle East. Yes, unpleasant, but realists argued necessary to balance Soviet power. But to be clear, this does not mean that realists celebrate immorality. Rather, they ask whether an action prudently advances the national interest. Politics may still have a moral dimension, but the yardstick is consequence, not intent. Liberals reject the idea that morality stops at the border and, by extension, the dual moral standard. Rather, they contend that international law, human rights, and institutions can embed moral standards even in an anarchic system. Think of NATO's 1999 intervention in Kosovo, which was justified as a duty to prevent ethnic cleansing, even though it bypassed explicit UN authorization. Many liberals believed that this was a necessary moral act, using force to protect human rights and prevent further violations of international law. It's easy to assume that realists are always more willing to use military force than liberals, but that's not necessarily true. Whether a specific theorist supports or opposes the use of force often depends less on their attitude towards violence itself and more on how they define the national interest or moral responsibility. For example, most leading realists, including John Mearsheimer, Stephen Walt, and Brent Scrocraw, opposed the 2003 U.S. invasion of Iraq not because they were pacifists, but because they believed the war didn't serve core U.S. strategic interests. For them, the goal of removing Saddam Hussein from power and establishing democracy in Iraq was not in the U.S. national interest and could even increase regional instability and divert resources from other counterterrorism operations. By contrast, many liberals supported the Iraq War, not because it served narrow strategic goals, but because they believed it could promote democracy, protect human rights, and enforce international norms, goals consistent with liberal ideals. So while realists may seem more skeptical of morality in foreign policy, they're often cautious about using force. And while liberals emphasize ethical principles, they're often open to military intervention when it's framed as a moral obligation. The dual moral standard, in other words, doesn't tell us whether a theorist would support or oppose a specific action. It tells us why they would support or oppose it. The dual moral standard helps us understand a key divide in international relations theory. Realists believe that leaders must act in the interest of the state, even if doing so means violating moral norms, filtering morality through prudence or the lens of the national interest. Liberals, by contrast, argue that morality is essential, even in an anarchic world, maintaining that justice can reinforce order and that ethics should guide policy, even under anarchy. Understanding the dual moral standard equips us to understand and analyze why leaders sometimes defend actions abroad that they would condemn at home, and why theorists disagree about when force is justified.